Today, we're going to be speaking with Dr. Robert Waldinger, who's the director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development and also co-author of the new book, The Good Life: Lessons from the World's Longest Scientific Study of Happiness. Really great to have you on. I appreciate your time.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So one of the really interesting things about this study, which started in 1938, is many studies on happiness are of different groups of people, sometimes from different countries, across different time periods, and it can become very difficult to really compare apples to apples, for lack of a better term. And one of the interesting things about this study that now has gone on more than 8 decades is it followed the same individuals and families. It's very extensive, asked a ton of questions, hundreds of measurements, includes blood work, brain scans. I mean, you're really approaching this from a sort of cover every aspect perspective. Can you tell us just a little bit about how this study started, the number of people that were originally part of it and the number that are still with us today?
Sure. It started as two studies that didn't know about each other. Started on different parts of the Harvard University campus. One was a study begun at Harvard Health Service, the student health service, with sophomores from Harvard College. And the other was a study of delinquency, a study of delinquent and non-delinquent boys from Boston's poorest neighborhoods, from the most troubled families. 268 Harvard College undergraduates, 456 inner city boys, and all of them were studied as a way to understand thriving, how kids moved from childhood into adulthood on good developmental paths, including the kids who were born with so many strikes against them, into such disadvantaged circumstances. So it was radical for its time to be doing these studies of human thriving. And then eventually my predecessor put the two studies together and started looking at them as contrasting groups.
When we look at the popular literature on happiness, there are all these often repeated ideas or rules of thumb or whatever the case may be. One of them is once you make $75,000 a year or its equivalent, when you get beyond that, you're not really anymore. Sometimes the term is satisfied with your life. Sometimes the term happy is used. Another one that you often hear is later in life, having spent more time in the office rarely correlates to more happiness, whereas having spent more time with family and having more close relationships does. And, then 5 years go by and there's another study that comes out and it has a slightly different result. On some of those sort of like lowest hanging fruit things that are often discussed, what has this study determined?
Well, we determined that the inner city group was no less happy than the privileged Harvard group. And that's more consistent with other studies that say basically once you get your basic economic needs met, then making more and more money doesn't do it, doesn't increase your happiness. And that seems to be a pretty robust findings across a lot of groups of people.
Is
So
there something to that $75,000 number that you found?
no, not 75,000 per se. And of course it varies depending on whether you live in, the middle of New York City or
Yes.
you live in rural Iowa, right? It's really the question of when you have your basic needs met. Once you've gotten to that point in terms of income, then more money doesn't do it for you. Then you can make millions more, and on average, people aren't happier.
There's this phrase, nobody is on their deathbed wishing they spent more time at the office, right? You hear that very often.
Yeah.
What does the study have to say about that dynamic?
Well, we asked people when our first generation folks were in their 80s, we asked them to look back on their lives. And we asked, what are you proudest of? And what do you regret the most? And what they regretted the most, particularly the men, because this was the World War II generation, they regretted the most spending too much time at work
Hmm.
and not spending enough time with the people they cared about. What they were proudest of was um, was to a person something to do with their relationships. So, they didn't say, I made a ton of money or I won all these awards. or I was famous. And we had people who were all of those things. They said I was a good boss, I was a good spouse, I was a good friend, a good parent, right? So when they were looking back on what was most meaningful, it wasn't about achievement, it was about connections.
Is it true that John F. Kennedy was one of the original participants?
It is true. And the only reason I can tell you that is because he was outed by another journalist about 15 years ago. Otherwise, we are bound to keep in confidence the identities of all of the people in our study. So, in fact, the book has stories of real people woven all through the book, but the names and the superficial details are disguised to make sure that we protect their privacy.
So it sounds like money beyond a certain level, not a big contributor to happiness. Fame, not a big contributor to happiness. Having spent a lot of time at the office, not necessarily a contributor. Relationships of different kinds, yes. Family, friendships, etc. What else are the kind of positively correlated stories that you find?
Taking care of your health matters a lot.
Mm.
It's like our grandmothers could have told us that, but what we find, and lots of studies find, is that getting regular health care, not smoking, not abusing alcohol and drugs, regular exercise, not becoming obese, all of those things make huge differences in years of life lived and also in years of healthy life. So it really matters a lot to take care of your health. Um, the surprising thing for us was the finding about relationships being so important because at first we thought, well, how could relationships actually get into your body and change your physiology? And now for the last 10 years, we've been studying that. Many other groups have too. And we're understanding that this is a very powerful, robust connection between relationships and physical health.
What about religion? Because religion can be a tough one where it can be hard to separate the effect of being part of a community and the social aspects versus the religiosity itself. And there's many studies on this. Did you find anything that would be sort of clear in the data about religious participation?
Well, we ask people, do you have a religious practice? Do you have a spiritual practice? And there were people who did, and there were people who did not. And when we compared those two groups, neither group was on average happier.
Hmm.
So didn't make a difference in your happiness whether you were spiritual or religious or not. But many of the religious and spiritual people said that during times of difficulty, their spiritual practices were helpful to them.
So that's more, I guess, qualitative than quantitative.
Yeah, but quantitatively, when you compare the two groups, no, one group isn't happier.
What about travel? Because one of the things that's often written about travel is because when you travel, you're not in your routine. Time seems to go by slower, which often one of the things we read is that over time, years go by very, very quickly. And part of this seems to be that there's no cognitive difference day to day when you're kind of in your normal day to day thing. So that travel is an interesting way. And one might think there might be some correlation to happiness as well there. Is there anything?
We did not study that specifically, but what you're saying makes a lot of sense. And what we do find is that more cognitive stimulation keeps us sharper over time, and that includes being connected with other people. So one of the effects we think of relationships on keeping our brains healthy
Yeah.
is that it stimulates us. People are always unpredictable. They're moving targets. What you're going to say to me next is something I don't know, right? And that keeps my brain clicking on all cylinders. That's a good thing for the brain. And I think what you're pointing out is that travel can do the same thing. That's why time seems to go more slowly during travel because we're like on alert. Like, what am I going to see now? How do I find my way here? It's all of those challenges that we think keeps us healthy cognitively as we get older.
One of the things that it's not unique to the United States, but it's certainly been written about a lot in the United States, is the trend that people move relatively frequently in modern American society, much more commonly than in other parts of the world, don't live near their families nor where they grew up. I was recently reading Jared Diamond's book about traditional societies, and he said a big difference there, aside from all sorts of other differences, is that in more traditional societies, people tend to live near where they grew up and near their family most of their lives. In the United States, it's increasingly uncommon. Was there something garnered from the study related to that about those who kind of stay what we might call close to home versus those that don't?
What we found was a difference in the inner city group from the Harvard group. And that made a whole lot of sense because the Harvard group was gathered from all over the country. Harvard College brings in undergrads from everywhere in the US
Right.
and sometimes abroad. Unlike the inner city group, where they were chosen because they lived in Boston, their families lived in Boston. And what we found then in the next generation was that, of course, more of the inner city group lived in this area, stayed near their families. Now, what we have not done is an analysis that compares, are those second generation people in the inner city group happier
Mm.
than the more widely dispersed Harvard people? I expect that research exists. We just haven't done it.
Interesting. In terms of the relationships, lots of studies on friendship that look at number of friends, but also quality of relationship. And what you see frequently repeated in popular publications is it's not about having many friends as one ages. It's about having a few very strong or rewarding relationships that really seems to correlate not only with happiness, but sometimes even like a health claim will be made. What about that distinction?
Well, what we find is that, as with so many things, when you follow thousands of lives, one size never fits all. So we're all on a spectrum temperamentally from introversion, shyness to extroversion. And most of us are somewhere in the middle, but there are extremes. And what we find is that shy people find lots of people around them to be stressful.
Hmm.
So actually, having a lot of connections in your life could be more stressful if you're temperamentally introverted. On the other hand, extroverted people get their energy from people, so they may need a lot of people. So what we find is that it's a highly individual matter, and that each of us can really discern for ourselves what's the amount of connection that works for me in my life, and how can I work to have the amount that feels right to me.
That's interesting. I mean, holding all else equal, do you know whether introverts or extroverts seem to be happier?
I don't know that. I do know that, for example, Susan Cain, some of her work, that there are people who work on this, and I don't believe people have found that introverts or extroverts are happier than the opposite extreme at all. I think one of the complicating factors is that our culture um, glorifies extroversion.
Yes.
Being a party animal, right? That's like an iconic character in films and literature, on social media, right?
Yes.
And so that bias toward extroversion can make introverted people feel like there may be something wrong with them. What we
Mm.
know is there isn't anything wrong with them at all. It's perfectly normal, adaptive. Some of the most wonderful, most brilliant, most talented people are shy. Not a problem.
The book is called The Good Life, Lessons from the World's Longest Scientific Study of Happiness. We've been speaking with the book's co-author, Dr. Robert Waldinger. Really appreciate your time and insights today.
Thank you for having me.